Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, of course, and I have noticed since I did some videos talking about the form of certain types of medieval swords and talking about the fact that they are broad at the base and how this may have been partially dictated by the materials available, the material science of blades at the time, that a lot of people have got the proverbial knickers in a twist on the internet about the fact that essentially I was bad-mouthing the quality of medieval swords. Now, the point that I was making was that materials available, whether it be the quality of the steel or the heat treatment or the type of heat treatment, let's bear in mind not all swords are made in the same way or heat treated in the same way or tempered in the same way, does dictate the form that they take. Okay, that was the point I was making. But what people seem to have taken issue with was that I pointed out that medieval sword blades had inferior steel blades on average than later period swords, be it rapiers or sabres or whatever. And some people have suggested that this is because I'm sort of trying to big up or fanboy the sabres because I like sabres. Well, you know what? I like lots of different types of swords. I like Roman, Gladius and Sparta. I love medieval swords. I love small swords and rapiers and falchions and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so it's literally not me fanboying. It's me purely talking about the steels that are exhibited in different periods of sword blades that we find in Europe. Okay, and there are some things that we just have to accept, and it is a pretty much unavoidable fact that there was an advancement in steel making technology from the Roman era right the way through up to obviously the industrial age. Now, quite simply, probably the biggest jump, so we've got bloomery steel, we've got blast furnace steel, and we've got, obviously in the earlier period, we've got pattern welding as well. And then into the industrial age, we've got what's called cast steel, what they called cast steel, not to be confused with cast iron, incidentally. And quite simply, once you have completely melted iron and then re-solidified it and then introduced the precise amount of carbon and other things that you want in it, obviously you're going to end up with a more consistent product. I thought I'd made that clear in my previous videos, but clearly that point slipped by some people. Now, does that make for a better sword? Well, on average, yes it does. Does that mean that all medieval swords were crap? No, it doesn't. Okay, so quite clearly, if we look at the Viking era, for example, at the beginning of the Viking era, we see that a very large number of blades are pattern welded, or let's say the migration era, a very large number of high status blades are pattern welded. That's not to say all blades were pattern welded, of course they weren't. Okay, we noticed that if we look at something like a sax, then very often we have a hard steel edge welded to a softer steel or even iron back, and there are various other ways of manufacturing them. But if we go all the way through to the late kind of Anglo-Saxon Viking era, we notice that in some cases pattern welding is purely put on for decorative purposes, and we get a kind of mono steel blade, and of course the famous Ulfberht swords, which are made of cast steel, which seems to originate from outside of Europe and was imported in probably from India, perhaps via the Middle East, we don't really know. And if we go through the medieval period, we get gradually better and better quality blades, and we get blast furnace steel that's much more consistent, has got less slag inclusions. But we have to remember there is a status shift as well. So obviously there were crap blades, there were average blades, and there were really good blades. And obviously if you're looking at a sword blade that was purchased by someone of extreme wealth, then that blade would be tested, it would be produced to the highest standards available and would be tested and would be a good, reliable steel sword blade. But we have to, when we're talking about the development of weapons, or any material culture really, any technology from history, we have to a certain extent talk about averages as well as variables. So whilst there were some very good quality steel blades in medieval Europe, we have to concede that on average, an average 16th, let's keep sabers out of it for a second, okay? So there's no bias here on my part. If we take an average 16th century blade and compare it to an average 13th century blade, on average we'll probably see that the blades are better quality steel, better heat treated in the 16th century than they were in the 13th century. This shouldn't be a great surprise because people at the time devoted huge amounts of effort and research and practice and learning and exchange of knowledge and money to make better and better steel blades. Should be no surprise, okay? There was a progression. Now, if we take that as a given, that the average quality of blades improved throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the medieval period, and into what we'd call the Renaissance, and then obviously into the Industrial Revolution, you have to then ask, so if the material was improving, did that affect blade designs? Well, as I've said before, my opinion is probably yes. Now, I should make a disclaimer at this point. I didn't sort of in a vacuum come up with this idea. Other people before me and other people with far greater knowledge on this topic have suggested this, sometimes off the record, sometimes on the record, that perhaps the materials available, and remember it might be the average, it might not be the best materials available, but the average materials available for blades may have dictated average blade designs. And I'm not going to quote this person because I don't know that they would want their opinions to be on this video because I might misrepresent their words. But there is a very eminent published researcher on the subject of medieval and Renaissance steel technology. Some of you will guess who I'm talking about, and they work for a very famous institution, and they have said to me that they believe that the types of sword blades we see developed in the 16th century and start to become common in the 16th century, and we're primarily here talking about side swords evolving into rapiers, not to say that side swords disappeared, but to say essentially the birth of the rapier and the preponderance of the rapier was partly, if not due, partly enabled by the great improvements in the average levels of steel for sword blades. So I'm not going to go on too much further about it there. I'm not going to go into the precise nature of how steel was produced in these periods, but suffice to say, I think it's basically an unarguable and unquestionable point that steel technology did improve through the medieval period and into the Renaissance and then obviously into the Industrial Age. And I think it only makes sense to assume that to some degree, even if it's a tiny amount, and this is obviously down to conjecture and opinion, that technology must have had some influence on the design of blades and weapons. Now it might be, as I say, it might be that it's only a small factor. It might be that medieval sword blades look a certain way for 95% other reasons or 99% other reasons. But I do think it must have played a part. And I also think just because we want to dispel myths about medieval swords, you know, they're not massively heavy, they are sharp, they're not bludgeoning instruments, all of these things. We want to dispel all of these myths. But what we never want to do is replace one set of myths with a new set of myths. I'm all about facts, statistics and truth, okay? And we shouldn't lie to ourselves that the average medieval sword blade from a museum or straight out of the ground from archaeology, if you analyze it, it will be full of slagging, not necessarily full of, but it will have slag inclusions and will have problems essentially with the blade that you don't find, or you don't find very often, in later period blades. So we have to accept that medieval European sword blades weren't perfect, nothing's perfect, but they did have issues that were overcome or at least minimized and reduced in later centuries. Okay, these aren't magical objects, they are simply a nicely made, sharp piece of metal, and the technology of making them did improve with time. I hope that clarifies some of my views on the subject, and don't take this as a personal slight against medieval martial arts or your love of medieval history. I'm purely about the facts. And if you overlook facts just to reinforce your own set of myths, then that's not science and that's not archaeology. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.